Good afternoon, everyone. Um, Welcome to another session of Translation Tuesday with Kitab Khana. Hello, Maithili. Hello, Monica. Hello, Kiran Shengele. Um, Anuja Sinha. So this is the ninth session of Translation Tuesday with Kitab Khana, and they've had some amazing veteran translators over the last couple of months, namely Tilottama Shom, Sampurna Chatterjee, Prema Jaikumar, B.R. Swaroop, and many more. Today we have with us Manisha Chaudhry. I'll tell a little bit more about her before she joins in. But let me tell you something about translations today. Translations are not a new thing today. They've been around for a while, but we see a resurgence in translated literature today yet again. And that is perhaps a very good sign for Indian literature. So I think Manisha Chaudhry has just joined. I'll just add her in and then we can start with the session. Hi Dinesh, hi Suchita, hi Nilay. Good evening.
Good evening.
So I just introduced the session today, but I'm going to introduce you the book and then we'll start with the interview. I have easy questions for you, so don't worry. But I've
How
wrote all of them down.
I'm not
Just
worried. I'm just worried about the medium. I'm not used to
okay.
talking to you like this.
Yes, I understand that can be, but this is the new normal.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, little bit about ma'am. Manisha Chaudhry has many years of experience in publishing as a publishing professional and in the social development sector. She started her career in publishing with India's first feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, in 1986, and has been a consultant to a range of organizations in the development sector and the UN. An editor and translator fluent both in Hindi and English, her translations and books have been published by Kali for Women, Oxford University Press, Suban Books, Niyogi Books, and Pratham. Apart from many other things, she is the founding trustee of Bukaru Children's Literature Festival. She was the editorial head at Pratham Books. She is the co-founder of Manan Books and currently the director of Manan Books. The book in concern today is Ba, originally written in Hindi by Giriraj Kishore and translated by ma'am. So, a very warm welcome to you for taking out time and coming here and experimenting with a new medium.
My pleasure.
A little bit about the book that we're going to talk about. It's Kasturba Gandhi, a biofiction. As I said earlier, it's been translated from Hindi. Uh, but let me tell you a bit more about the author. Unfortunately, he passed away early this year. Uh, but he survives through his work and the contributions to literature he's done. With a literary career spanning more than a half a century, Giriraj Kishore has mastered the art of storytelling. His writings include award-winning novels, short story collections, and plays, Dhai Ghar, Jugalbandi, Chiriyaghar, Log, Yatha Prastavit, Yatraएं, Do, and Pehla Girvitiya, to name just a few. As registrar of IIT Kanpur, he founded the Center for Creative Writing. He has been the convener of the Hindi Committee of Sahitya Academy, Delhi, a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and emeritus fellow of the Ministry of Culture. Giriraj Kishore has been honored with many awards, including the Padma Shri, the Sahitya Academy Award, Saraswati Samman, and the Sahitya Bhushan Award from Uttar Pradesh. The first publication that we first published the Girmitiya saga, which is known as Pehla Girmitiya in Hindi, which talks about about South Africa in the 19th and the 20th century, the socio-political background, and that too was a bestseller for how God knows how many years. So this is what I've given about the book, the author, and the reading material if you'd like to read more about the author. But let's talk about translations today, yet again. And so my questions to you are, ma'am, we'll begin with how and why you got interested in this specific book on Ba. Why did you think that this book needs to be projected on a national and international front through English translation?
Okay, so that's an easy one, Trisha. Thank you. That is an easy question to answer. It's because I believe that history is as much made up of Nayaks as it is made up of Nayikas, right? There are heroes and there are heroines, and there are heroes in history that we hear a lot about, and the heroines not enough. So in this case, it's really quite easy. I don't even have to go into the details of it. It is because we know everything about Gandhi that there is to know, right? I mean, he's probably the most overwritten figure in history, if you like, because everybody has picked up some angle or the other to highlight, and rightly so, because he has a place in history, sure. But we call him the Mahatma. And we need to understand how is it that he became the Mahatma that he was. And I think that because Girirajji had a similar sort of question in his mind, that was what led to Pehla Girmitiya. I mean, it's about history, but it's also about the man, you know, and how he became this very important figure in history. And then I think a natural follow-up to that was that while he was thinking and talking and writing about Gandhi, somewhere this thought wormed his way into his consciousness that what about Ba? I mean, isn't her journey just as important? Hasn't she made an absolutely seminal contribution to Bapu becoming the Mahatma that we know him today as? So I think he decided that he must do this because somewhere history has been unfair to Ba. And as a feminist and as a translator, writer, or somebody who's had an engagement with feminism, the understanding that history needs to have as many Nayikas as there are Nayaks, it was sort of a very natural idea for me to think of translating Ba, because there is simply not enough about her. We just sort of see some shadowy photographs, wo piche khadi hain kahin pe, or, you know, people will only talk about her sort of ability to cook and feed large numbers of people in the ashram and so on. But, you know, there is much more to that. There's much more to her journey as a child bride, and then becoming the first woman satyagrahi in South Africa. So that journey is just as fascinating, and I think it needs to it needs to be given as much attention as the journey of Bapu. So I think somewhere along the way I held hands with Girirajji and his idea that Ba needs to be talked about more, or Ba needs to be understood more. She simply needs to be given her place in history. So I think that was one of my main drivers.
Yeah. So in the introduction, the author, which you've also translated, he mentions, I had made a list of about 2,000 books in Hindi and English written by Indian and foreign authors on Gandhi. Making a list is easy, but okay, getting the books is another matter. But then there was not much information, not a historical documentation on Kasturba Gandhi at all. There was very few. So that gets me to the next question. You translated this book. How did you approach the book? And I ask this because biofictions often tend to lapse into an eulogy. Does that happen in this book? Or Girirajji gives a proper historical perspective to the subject? Or does he see him with awe and reverence? If so, then as a translator, how did you resolve this issue to make the cultural transfer acceptable to the readers?
Okay, that's like a double-barrel question because you put question and sub-question into it, right? So I'm going to try and answer for Girirajji, which is not entirely a fair thing to do because he should have been answering some of these questions. But because of my engagement with the text, I will attempt to answer some of it. So as a translator, I approach things with enthusiasm. So that's a very simple answer. So I approached this book with a similar sort of, I'm sort of interested in the subject matter and I look at the language and I either relate to it or I grapple with it or whatever. So I went through a similar process. As far as Girirajji is concerned and his motivations or his reverence or eulogy or the tendency to eulogize and so on, I mean, I can only give my comments on that. And I think that he certainly approached her with reverence because he saw her as a very important figure in the making of the Mahatma, as well as a very representative woman who grew from one place to the next. And I mean, every human being's growth is interesting and important.
Yeah.
So with sort of giving respect to all of that, he approached the subject. But because, like you mentioned, there was such a paucity of material on Ba, when you compare it to the excess of material on Gandhi, I think he was kind of driven towards the biofiction genre because there was, her life was so intertwined with history that, of course, she's a figure in the sweep of history somewhere, but he was interested in the person. And I mean, the personal journey and the personal growth of this human being was as important to him as as the historical events. And the historical events are not difficult because they are fact, or they have lots of supportive evidence and so on. So that is not difficult to translate because that is already part of our consciousness. I mean, the challenge lies both for the writer or for the translator. In this case, when you're talking about a figure who's well known and yet not well known, which is why then you're choosing to use imagination to fill in the blanks. And you try and stand in her shoes and you say that, okay, at this vantage points in history, how did I feel? Or what did I think? Or how was I sort of confronted with totally wild happenings, which I never thought would happen to me, but they are happening and I need to cope, or I need to not more than cope, I need to actually change how I look at things and so on. So all that you can only imagine, her life of the mind, her emotional growth, all the trials that a family person undergoes when you live with a driven figure like Gandhi, who was absolutely driven in so many ways, and that took a huge toll on the family because all the relationships with the children were so difficult, and Ba as the mother and as the loyal wife was sort of forever trying to strike a balance between the two. So in the biofiction, you try and be fair to everybody, and you sort of yet give greater space to the emotional journey of the protagonist. In this case, it is Ba. So the cultural transfer actually really for me was in conveying the feelings. So there was an underlying feeling in how Giriraj Kishore ji thought of Ba. And when he decided to become her, in this biofiction kind of mode, he had to imagine all kinds of things that he didn't have any personal experience of either. He could only imagine that she probably felt like this or that. So, there's an underlying feeling level at all texts work. And he kind of tried to grapple with that and had varying degrees of success. I mean, there are parts of the novel which are stronger than the other parts, excuse me. So as a translator, it was conveying the feeling across all the historical events, that what might have happened to her when she was really little and she was quite fearless and she used to sort of talk back to him and put him in his place because he was always trying to dominate her when he was growing up. They literally grew up together, they were married so young and so on. And later on, when as his political ideology evolved and he had to convince her about a lot of things in South Africa. But once she got convinced, she was absolutely his companion in everything. I mean, she was the first woman satyagrahi who went to jail.
Yes.
I mean, in the history of humankind. So for that to happen, what all negotiations happened between them.
Mm.
What happened to the children, and how did she deal
Mm.
with that? So all
Yeah.
those kinds of things are all rooted in a deeply emotional experience,
Mm.
for the writer, and then by corollary for me also. So
Yeah.
the cultural transfer was really rooted in the feeling transfer. That was I able to
Yeah.
capture the feeling in this part or that part.
Hmm. Okay. So that gets me to the narrative, which is quite interesting because while I was reading it, I noticed that two-thirds of the book is in third person, as in every omniscient narrator. But interestingly, one-third of the book is written from Kasturba Gandhi's diary, and it's written in first person. So as a translator, what kind of strategic register did you adopt there to seamlessly transfer these two styles into an alien language?
I mean, again, it was like a kind of beginning to understand why Girirajji did that. It is
Hmm.
because there was a paucity of material, and
Yeah.
because he wanted probably to feel closer to Ba, and there
Hmm.
was simply not enough anecdotal material to sort of go by beyond a point. It was not her diary,
Hmm.
actually. It was the diary of somebody who was attending to her in her last days. So he adopts
Hmm.
all kinds of stylistic devices to sort of capture the essence of her life in different ways. So the
Hmm.
Aga Khan Palace, where she passed away
Yes.
and where the latter
Hmm.
half of the book is located, and the
Hmm.
beginning of the book. In the beginning of the book,
Yes.
there are a few pages where Aga Khan Palace itself is speaking as a person. And
Yes.
the
Hmm.
palace is saying that I have seen this in my life and now I see this and so
Hmm.
on. So that personification
Hmm.
of the building and all the
Hmm.
people who have passed through its portals. And then
Hmm.
in the end, there's Aga Khan Palace again. And then there is this person in there, all these people who were imprisoned, excuse me,
Hmm.
together. And all of them were looking after Ba because she was literally on her in her last days and so on. So
Yes.
that was a huge stylistic jump from the rest of the book,
Hmm. Yeah.
because the rest of the book we are coasting along merrily. We're looking at
Hmm.
events in her life, this happened, that happened, and some of it
Hmm.
from history and so on. And suddenly you go into this intense detail of everything that happened to her physically. Which day the
Hmm.
doctor gave her what kind of medicine, and then there was even internal sort of a bit of a strife in the family because the children wanted to try the new antibiotics which were available, whereas Bapu was against it. And Ba, of
Hmm.
course, was too ill to know, what was going on around her. So the two of them had to decide what to do, whether
Hmm.
they should continue to treat her with penicillin, which had
Hmm.
newly been discovered at the time, and so on.
Hmm.
So all that is
Hmm.
recorded in very, very intense detail. But I
Hmm.
think that was Giriraj ji's way of trying to get closer to Ba as well as trying to get closer to Bapu and Bapu's
Hmm.
understanding of what Ba actually meant to him. Because it
Yeah.
is in those times when you see all these people who are surrounding her, they really loved her. They'd all
Hmm.
been touched by her in some way or the other in their lives. And they
Hmm.
all want to do whatever they can to sort of save her or make her last days, easier or more comfortable and so on. So there's like lots of intense grief in those
Yeah.
pages. But
Hmm.
that is also the time that Bapu actually begins to realize what Ba was. So, the
Hmm.
all the love that she held in her heart, all the grit that she showed throughout her life to put up with all kinds
Hmm.
of really, really amazing things that happened to her ability to hold people together and be very normal
Hmm.
about it, about, I
Hmm.
mean, feeding hundreds of people was not a big deal. Somebody
Yeah.
coming by and asking for something which was forbidden in the ashram and Ba breaking the rules to give it to that person, never mind what Bapu said. So all these
Hmm.
things, which sort of made up the personality of Ba, and she was not afraid to ask questions.
Hmm.
I mean, she had
Yeah.
no ideas of, oh, I will look stupid or something like that. If she didn't sort
Hmm.
of understand what was going on, she would just come and question Bapu, and he had to give her
Hmm.
a reasonable answer.
Hmm.
So all those things somewhere get tied up in that last thing because he sees her as this person who has been his companion for so long, and how
Hmm.
she has actually contributed to making him who he was, to even begin to
Hmm.
understand the concept of satyagraha. that a satyagraha can only be successful if you are convinced about your agraha. It has to be rooted in
Yeah.
satya.
Yeah.
Unless it's rooted in your personal truth, unless your belief in it is complete, how can you go around offering satyagraha where you know you're going to be beaten the moment you take the next step forward?
Yeah.
So, all those kinds of things, they all sort of come together in that very personal bit. So yeah, so it was tough to make that switch because till you had a sort of fairly conventional narrative going along, and then this very intense detail and this intense personalization of her suffering was quite a switch stylistically. But then again, I'm fortunate. I'm translating at a time when people are using all kinds of stylistic devices.
Yeah.
They're not startling anymore in the sense that I'm
Mm.
sure 50 years ago, if somebody had adopted two very different registers in a very slim book, there would be like much more talk about it. Now it's much more normalized, because people switch
Yeah.
between a diary format and multiple perspectives and so on quite a lot. So it excuse me, it wasn't that difficult for me. Yeah.
Okay. In a time when we take a lot of things as granted or people ignored, I think this is an awakening for a lot of people. I felt while reading the book that yes, we take a lot of people for granted and we shouldn't be doing it. We should understand what they're going through. So it had also a psychologically different effect on me. I'm sure the readers will also understand that. But let's come to the translation again. It is of as translated. So this is a direct question on general translation. It is often said that translators are traitors. It is also said that translations can never justify the original. It is said in the act of translation there is a lot of loss of in transition. On the other hand, it is only through translation that we can understand literature from all across the globe. We can acquaint ourselves. So, what are your thoughts as a scholar and a translator? What are your thoughts on this paradox?
So, Trisha, you're answering your own questions. I don't even have to work very hard to answer that one. So, a translator as a traitor? No, you have to be kinder than that to me, because I think of a translator as a traveler without a visa, right? I mean,
Okay.
as a translator, I travel between languages or lands or people or new readers and so on, and I don't need anything other than the act of translation to do that.
Yeah.
So instead of thinking of me as a traitor, you think of me as somebody who's carrying the work to a new land,
Yeah.
finding new readers, finding new dialogues forming in a new language, in a manner where maybe the original matrix of where the work was located in the source language may shift a little bit.
Hmm.
But I think
Yeah.
it's a shift which has many more gains than the losses. As far as
Hmm.
translation justifying an original, it's not meant to justify an original. A translation stands on its own merit. It is an
Hmm.
independent creative work.
Hmm.
The original is sort of the spark which lights up the translation. Of course, the
Yeah.
translation has to have its own light as well. So there's no sort of there's no competition that I must justify the original, or I'm under some great pressure to sort of
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
match the original in some way. No, I'm not
Hmm.
trying to do that even. It is an interpretation. It is my
Yeah.
subjective interpretation. And
Hmm.
once I am comfortable with the fact that I can only interpret something through my own subjectivity, and that's all right. And I have set out to
Hmm.
do this precisely for that reason. It's because I have the subjective right to read it in my own way that I'm attempting to
Hmm.
carry it into a new language. So
Hmm.
I think whatever I do is the best that I can do at that particular point in time.
Hmm.
And if it's actually gaining readers and new minds,
Hmm.
it's initiating dialogues in other languages and other lands.
Hmm.
I think it's fine, traitor or no traitor. I think it's a good thing that I'm doing.
Yes, I am now hung up on the words traveler without a visa. I really, really understand and relate to that phrase. But tell us something about the translation process. how did you go about translating it actually? Did you consult the author or how was it?
So in this case, I spoke to Girirajji on phone. After I
Hmm.
read the book, I found that, culturally the Hindi was not difficult for me because he
Hmm.
speaks in a very Western UP kind of language, and I'm
Hmm.
from Western UP. So that
Okay.
whole leja, that whole sort of the cadence of that language is not unfamiliar to me. So I rang him
Hmm.
up and we had a long, long, long phone conversation. And by the
Mm-hmm.
end of the conversation, he said, "ठीक है, बिल्कुल, आप मुझे लगता है कि आपको करना चाहिए." So that was it. I said to him that, can I call you up again if I get stuck or if there's a problem or something like that? He says, मुझे नहीं लगता कि ऐसी जरूरत पड़ेगी. But of course, you can call me up, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And as it so happened, I didn't actually need to call him up because once I started to translate, I translate in my own idiosyncratic kind of way, where I first do a translation without sort of thinking too much about it. I literally a transfer of the language.
Hmm.
Then I give a lot of distance to the text. I mean, once I've done
Hmm.
one round, I wait for many days so that I'm
Hmm.
completely dissociated from whatever translation I have done. And then
Okay.
I go back and read it. And
Hmm.
so it is this process that really helps me, where I work on it and then I stop completely. And
Okay.
then when I go back to it after many, many days where I've been doing completely different things and so on, it helps me to look at it with a completely fresh eye, and all
Hmm.
the stupidities of language, all the awkwardnesses of transfer and so on, they immediately leap out at me. Because while I'm
Hmm.
doing it, I'm, of course, I'm unconscious to all of that. I can't see them.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
after a few days and taking my mind away from it, when I go back
Hmm.
to it, I improve it and I improve it and I improve
Hmm.
it. So I do that process many times. And
Hmm.
if during those times I feel that I am unclear about something, or some
Hmm.
passage for me is not really working, that is the time
Hmm.
to consult the author, if
Okay.
the author is available. Where you talk to them at length. You don't talk about the specific paragraph, you talk about that whole section, so that you try and
Hmm.
understand why they wrote it that way. So it's all
Hmm.
about catching the feeling. So if you're
Hmm.
able to catch the feeling as to, what were they feeling when they were writing it, what was their attempt,
Hmm.
what feeling were they attempting to convey, uh,
Hmm.
if you get a sort of handle on that, then when you look at the translation, you try
Hmm.
and incorporate that, or you try and sort of relate to that feeling
Hmm.
and bring it into the new language. So that is how usually I work. And in this case, like I said, because the first conversation with Giriraji was so encouraging and so illuminating, and I didn't
Hmm.
actually feel that in any passage I needed to go back, because it was very transparent the way he wrote.
Hmm.
It was not obtuse, it was not elliptical, it was not
Hmm.
something where I wasn't 100% sure what was he trying to do with the language.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I just did it, and then I sent it to you guys, and you all
Yeah.
looked at it, and there were not too many corrections and so on, but of course I had looked at it many times before I sent it to you. So yeah.
That was quite helpful. This is the first time I perhaps have got an insight on the actual working of translation. I think I should adopt it and try it out on myself as well. But you've also translated a street in Srinagar by Chandrakanta, and I think
Yeah.
it was also nominated or shortlisted for DAC prize as well.
Yeah.
Was the translation process any different there?
Yeah, because I think the two books were so different. I'm not so familiar with Kashmir. So I spent
Mm-hmm.
a much longer time with Chandrakanta ji. I met her in person on at
Hmm.
least two occasions where we talked about Kashmir a lot.
Hmm.
Not
Hmm.
specifically about the book, but there were sections in the book which I needed to just hear from her, her own view of her Kashmiriyat. So
Mm-hmm.
whether it was, describing a wedding ritual, or a
Hmm.
song, a snatch of a song which was there, or something. So when we just hung around together, I mean, I literally
Hmm.
went to her house and we just hung around with her. She was kind enough to give me
Hmm.
lunch, and like we just talked about this, that, and the other. And of course, Kashmir would keep coming back. So it
Hmm.
really helped me to kind of get a feel of living that culture, just being
Okay.
around her. So in her case, it was a state which was familiar to me, but not so familiar as, say, the way that Giriraj Kishore's language made his Hindi familiar to me.
Yeah. Okay. So now that gets me to the next question. I've got one question also. Can you throw some light on why translation genre is not much talked about? Oh, no, we'll take it up a little later. Okay, about the way it is internationally. Okay, so there is an international comparison that we're talking about. Would you like to answer the question now or later?
Uh, I am not very clear as to what is the question. I mean,
Okay,
translation is not talked about that much in India as opposed to how much it's talked about internationally. Is that the
nationally.
question?
Yes,
I
yes.
think it's got something to do with the maturity of our publishing industry, perhaps, where
Okay.
because our publishing industry is still in a sort of a phase where, as a nation in a post-colonial society, we are still finding our feet vis-a-vis our relationship with our own languages.
Yeah,
Right? It's like
yeah.
the sort of cultural rupture that has happened where most of us are talking in English to each other, and
Hmm.
perhaps our own grip on our own languages is not so strong anymore.
Yeah.
It's because of that there is not enough translation which is happening in the country, given the fact that
Hmm.
we have so many languages.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
if that much is not published in our languages, if there is not enough intra-language translations happening within the
Hmm.
country, I mean,
Hmm.
obviously there will be less conversation around it as well. Whereas
Hmm.
internationally, translations have brought so many classics to all of us.
Hmm.
So the way the
Yeah.
publishing industry has looked at translation and has looked at material which can be made
Hmm.
available through translation is quite
Hmm.
different from how we look at our own material, because the transfer from the language to publishing a published book has not
Hmm.
happened enough.
Yeah. Yeah. True. So the next question now, we just broke a chain a bit, but it's about how do you decide to translate which books? Does it depend on the translatability of the book or otherwise? And hence the question follows, what kinds of books are translatable?
I think almost every book is translatable if it has a universality in it.
Hmm.
If the intention of the original author is one to sort of look at universal emotions or try to convey the human experience in such a way that has a universal resonance, that book is
Hmm.
translatable. I think the books which
Okay.
are very hard to translate or are practically untranslatable are the ones which are hyper local and which use sort of
Okay.
lots of dialogues in dialect, where the
Hmm.
humor depends on very, very local references. Perhaps those
Hmm.
books are perhaps they shouldn't be translated. Perhaps they shouldn't be translated in the same way. Perhaps they should be translated like a play or something else,
Huh.
because those books are frightfully hard to translate. And I wonder if it's even worth the effort, if they're
Hmm.
hyper local and they have a great following in the original language. It's because they're so rooted in that particular culture and the humor and the dialect and the
Hmm. Yeah.
dialogues and so on. They work seamlessly because that is how you and I would speak if we were speakers of that
Hmm.
language. Then I mean, I think
Hmm.
that book is doing a great service, and it's why should it sort of struggle and kill itself to try and work in another language when it's going to do
Hmm.
perhaps only one-fourth of what it was originally to do. So as far
Hmm.
as my
Perhaps.
own decisions are concerned, I have I am completely idiosyncratic. I just either like a book or I don't like a book. If I like a book, I
Yeah.
think it is translatable, and if I don't like it for some reason, or it doesn't touch me in some way, then I wouldn't translate
Hmm.
it just because it's a great classic or something like that. I mean, it has to
Hmm.
speak to you in
Hmm.
some way. It's a very,
Hmm.
very sort of personal thing, and the more
Hmm.
you read in both
Hmm.
languages, the more open
Hmm.
you become to translating different things. I mean, to become a good translator, you have to read and read and read. So
Yeah.
that you know the plasticity of the language becomes more evident to you.
Evident.
So I
Yeah.
think it's a. I mean, if you asked me this 10 years ago, I would have probably answered in a different way, and I would have said that more books are untranslatable than not. But today, I feel
Okay.
that lots of books are translatable, but they just have to speak to the translator.
Yes, later. Yes. But I also feel that language, sometimes when the writer plays on the language, the words, the idioms, and a lot of things, sometimes I find it very difficult to translate it. How do you translate a portion wherein there's a word play, which is only only to that language, only limited to the language? How do you translate that? It's just beyond me. At times, I feel the play of language, the beauty of the original language cannot be translated. It'll be just lost if you do that. So,
Yeah, perhaps. So if
but,
it's if it's particular idioms that you're trying to render in a new language, that transfer is very awkward. And
yeah,
I think the attempt should be to capture the milieu in which that idiom is located.
yes.
It's easier to describe a milieu and possibly keep the original idiom. तो
Yeah.
अगर मेहनती रीडर होगा ना, तो जाके पता
Huh.
करेगा कि वो ओरिजिनल लैंग्वेज का जो इडियम आपने इंक्लूड किया है
Hmm.
उसके क्या मायने हैं. Because
Huh.
you have created the milieu in such a way that that person is drawn into this
Yes.
new universe, then
Yeah.
translating that particular idiom in that new language is not that critical. I think you should probably keep it in the original language. I mean, of course, we're talking in generalities. I'm sure
Hmm.
in every specific situation you have to make your own decisions. But
Hmm.
वो जो मुहावरों का translation अंग्रेजी में,
Hmm.
या trying to find
Hmm.
an equivalent muhavra in English and so on.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, that is all very awkward, so
Yeah.
it rarely works, and it really makes the language sound very stilted, and it
Yeah.
basically takes away from the ambience and the milieu that you're trying to create. So I think perhaps
Yes.
the way out of it is that you keep the original. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, as publishers, you and I would know that earlier we used to italicize so much more. So many words
Yeah.
which were from another language you
Yes.
could italicize. Now you don't,
No,
simply
don't. Yeah.
because either those words have become much more in common parlance, they are used much more, or you simply expect the reader to find out,
Yeah.
to work a little harder with the text, because they
Mm.
care. They care enough
Yeah.
about the book to want to know ki acha,
Mm.
if it was this machi ka naam, so what cultural resonance does Ilish Mach have for you?
Mm.
You know
Yeah. Yeah.
that kind of thing.
So,
But you should not have to keep on explaining, oh, Ilish Mach, the fish which was like this, whatever.
yeah. So I think we've got the question, should there be an explanation to that in the notes or notes to the translation? I think we've done that, covered that already.
Yeah.
But then reading translation is also, you have to immerse yourself completely in it. It's not a very, very easy job. It's only the very serious readers would indulge in such kind of understanding of um, these muhavra, which have not been translated but are in common parlance and things like that, if I don't know about it and things. I think
Mhm.
most readers want to make that effort now. I think the readership is changing, and I think it's a good beginning that we have had already. But then let's come to children. Since you've been in children publishing for so long, could you please throw some light or share your thoughts on
Hello, I didn't
yeah.
hear the question. Yes,
Okay.
can you just say that again?
Yeah. Since you've been in children's publishing, literature publishing for so long, what are your thoughts on exposing children to translated literature, world literature, as well as in their mother tongues?
So that would depend entirely on the age and the readiness to read of the child. I
Hmm.
sincerely believe that all children's first books should be in the mother tongue.
Hmm.
Absolutely, because that is the time that the child is learning to express herself well, and if she finds books in her mother tongue, it gives her great confidence because the language that she
Hmm.
is beginning to play with and so on, she can find in the printed word. The stories are set in a language which is familiar to her. Possibly the themes and the world which is reflected in the books somewhat mirrors her own world. So the first books or the
Hmm.
initial years should be the time to expose children to their mother tongue more and more, even through the printed word. That gives a
Hmm.
great sense of rootedness. It also helps to develop language structures in the brain so
Hmm.
that the child learns to read better, speak better, express better. Once the
Hmm.
language structures are reasonably developed and the child is a fluent reader, of course, you
Hmm.
should expose her to translated literature or world literature or whatever you want to call it, because then
Hmm.
the child has the confidence to sort of know more and know that the world is bigger than her immediate surroundings. And
Hmm.
like Gandhiji said, I think there was that famous quote of his that you live in your own house, but you keep the windows open, but you don't let the wind blow you off your feet or something.
Both, yeah.
I forget the
Yes,
exact
yes.
words, but he basically talks about the importance of living in your own house with the windows open and yet not getting blown away by the winds that come from there. So
Hmm.
when the child is at a stage where she's reading fluently, she's ready for open
Hmm.
windows, and she's
Hmm.
ready for new kinds of currents, which should come her way. And books are a window to newer worlds,
Hmm.
whether they're emotional worlds or whether they're geographical worlds or whether they're historical worlds and so on. So
Hmm.
once you're reading, then, I mean, I would find it just as fascinating to read something from Russia
Hmm.
as I would, that I would read something from Jharkhand,
Hmm.
right? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, I am familiar with Jharkhand in one particular way if I was a Jharkhandi child. But then, I mean, I,
Hmm.
I would like to know about Siberia or this place which is snowbound all the time, where the animals are different, where people eat different foods, or
Yeah.
Eskimos who live in igloos and so on and so forth. So, I mean, if you go back to your own childhood, you will remember
Hmm.
those illustrated books which had these
Yeah.
igloos, and you're
Hmm.
thinking, oh my God, you can live in a nice house and so on. So, I mean, that is a kind of translation, that is a kind of exposure to the world. So,
Hmm.
certainly it can only happen through world literature. And if I got a folk tale, say, from that part of the
Hmm.
world,
Hmm.
where there was a little girl like myself, but she was eating something different, or she dressed differently, or she called her
Hmm.
grandfather something else than what I do, and so on. And that is
Hmm.
my way of understanding that the world is full of interesting things and people. So for children, I
Hmm.
think it's the age and the stage of readiness in terms of reading
Hmm.
that would critically determine
Hmm.
whether you have more emphasis on the mother tongue or you also
Hmm.
expose them to world literature. And it doesn't have to be either or. After a certain
Hmm.
age,
Yeah.
I mean, you continue to read in your mother tongue. In an ideal world, all Indians should be trilingual, right? We all
Hmm.
should
Yeah.
be able to
Actually.
read.
Yeah.
We should be able to read our own mother tongues, possibly read the state language or whatever, and then read a language like English or French or whichever other language.
Hmm.
So I think it doesn't have to be either or. It really has to be get children reading, right?
Hmm.
And for that, if you get them reading in the mother tongue first, it's more likely that they will get reading in other languages, or they will simply read more because they're used to reading,
Yeah.
because their first experience of reading was enjoyable and it was
Hmm.
not frightening. It was not,
Yeah.
so many shapes on a page which they didn't understand. It was a language
Yeah.
which, even if their mother or their grandmother is reading out to them or the teacher is reading out to them, it's a language which was familiar to them.
Hmm.
So then the book is
Yeah.
not an alienating object. It is a
Hmm.
fascinating object.
Yeah. No, I remember when we were young, my parents made sure that I read a lot of translated literature like Toto Chan and Grimm's Tales and Daddy Long Legs and Kids and Cubs, so many. But I also remember reading Shelley in Bangla translation.
Hmm.
I to a convent school, a Catholic school, where English was my first language. I was taught in that language. But at home, my grandmother used to read me the comics like Nonte Fonte and things like
Mm,
that. So
mm,
somehow it was always fun. It was interesting to actually read in Bangla and even
mm,
the English translations in Bangla. So English books in Bangla also. But
sure, sure.
so that
No,
is
and
also quite.
people will also tell you that a child who's multilingual,
Hmm,
uh, their brains are much more adaptable for so many things than a child
hmm,
who's monolingual.
yeah,
So, all of us have actually, we are surrounded by so many languages. It's such an advantage that we are
yeah,
naturally multilingual because we have the
yes,
opportunity to be. And I think we
hmm,
should really see that as an asset and not as a problem. So this sort
yeah,
of great anxiety that, oh, let's teach our children English earlier and earlier and earlier. Nursery से ही
hmm,
उनको English में ही पढ़ा दो and अपनी भाषा तो
hmm,
ना सीखें, it doesn't matter. I don't
hmm,
actually agree with that at all. I really do believe that children are capable of being multilingual and
hmm,
really should be reading in their mother tongues first.
hmm. But now let's talk about a little capability versus availability. Um, like when I was in school, I remember I learned Sanskrit, I learned Hindi, and I learned English. But I never did I feel that there was an overlap. Which from when I've heard from my elders that even in the English paper they were given a Hindi or a Bangla text to be translated into English, but that
Mhm.
interlanguage study is perhaps not there in schools these days. Will that affect the availability of translators in the future?
Of course, of course. I mean, even now you will find that a very large number of translators are accidental translators.
Mm,
It's not like, there was any sort of formal exposure to the discipline or they decided to become translators. If they happened to have facility with two languages and the opportunity presented itself for some crazy reason, that's how they became
mm,
translators.
yeah,
Most of them. I mean, except
yeah.
I'm sure I shouldn't generalize across because there
Mm,
must be people who must trained to be translators
absolutely.
today and so on. But earlier there was very little available which would professionally train you how to become a
Mm,
translator. And
mm,
moreover, if there is a imbalance in the availability of reading material in one language versus availability of reading material in your own language,
mm,
your ability to transact with both with equal facility is going to be affected.
yeah.
So, when I was growing up, there were many magazines in Hindi
Mm,
which don't exist now. And, when
no,
my
no.
children were growing up, in fact, I got into children's multilingual publishing purely because when I was looking for Hindi books to read to my children, I found that
Mm,
if they had 125 English books, I was hard put to find 25 Hindi books,
wow.
which would be of a similar complexity at different age groups and so on, which I could read to them. So if
Mm,
there's the availability of English is so much more, I mean,
mm,
then the struggle to retain their interest in Hindi is that much harder for a parent
mm,
and for the school system. So it is, I mean, it is entirely, the onus is on us to
mm,
have enough material which is interesting, which is child centric, which is age appropriate in all the
mm,
languages. I mean, so
yes,
it is
yes.
an absolutely vital component of education to
Mm,
have material in different languages so that children, can move between languages with ease and get exposure to the literature and the beauty of their own language just as much as they get exposure to English. I mean, if
yes.
you and I, we belong to a certain social class or a certain milieu, and we went to
Mm,
these English medium schools, so all of us grew up with Enid Blyton and Your Grimm's fairy
yeah,
tales and
yeah.
Pippi Longstocking or whatever. So it
Mm,
is actually, I mean, in an ideal world, all children should have equal amount of reading material in their mother tongue as well.
yes. Mm,
Thereafter, whoever, I mean, if we are talking about the autonomy of the child to choose, you
mm,
have to present the choices also, no?
yes, yes,
And you have to present
absolutely.
enough choice for the child to make a sort of choice towards, doing this or that. If
Mm,
already the thing is weighted against your own language in this particular way because the availability is simply doesn't match the English, I mean,
Hmm.
then what happens is that you're stunting the linguistic ability of the child, both in the original language or the mother tongue language, as well as in
Hmm.
English.
Yeah.
Because not all children want to read English either. So, to
Hmm.
have good expression in any language, you have to read a lot,
Yes, absolutely.
right? So, and to want to become a translator, it's only when you have read enough literature in your own language would you want to become a translator from that language to English as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much. That was most insightful. We'll have to keep it short so that I can convince people to read this book and more translation after this session. This book is called Kasturba Gandhi by Giriraj Kishore, translated by Manisha Chaudhry. Do pick up this book and read it, and do let us know how you feel about it. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time and those
Now,
beautiful words. Traveler without a visa, it's stuck with me right now, and I think I'm going to shamelessly quote this many places. Thank
oh,
you
feel
very
free.
much, and
Okay. Bye.
hope to
Thanks, Trisha.
speak to you soon.